A Mess of Pottage by Laurence Dunbar. It was because the Democratic candidate for governor was such an energetic man that he had been able to stir Little Africa, which was a Republican stronghold, from center to circumference. He was a man who believed in carrying the war into the enemy's country. Instead of giving them a chance to attack him, he went directly into their camp, leaving discontent and disaffection among their allies. He believed in his principles. He had faith in his policy for the government of the state, and more than all, he had a convincing way of making others see as he saw. No other Democrat had ever thought it necessary to assail the stronghold of Little Africa. He had merely put it into his forecast as solidly against, sent a little money to be distributed desultorily in the district, and then left it to go its way, never doubting what that way would be. The opposing candidates never felt that the place was worthy of consideration, for as the chairman of the Central Committee said, holding up his hand with the fingers close together, "What's the use of wasting any speakers down there? We've got 'em just like that." It was all very different with Mr. Lane. "Gentlemen," he said to the campaign managers, "that black district must not be ignored. Those people go one way because they are never invited to go another." "Oh, I tell you now, Lane," said his closest friend, "it'll be a waste of material to send anybody down there. They simply go like a flock of sheep, and nothing is going to turn them." "What's the matter with the bellwether?" said Lane sententiously. "That's just exactly what is the matter. Their bellwether is an old deacon named Isham Swift, and you couldn't turn him with a 40-horsepower crank. There's nothing like trying. There are many things very similar to failing, but none so bad." "I'm willing to take the risk." "Well, all right, but whom will you send? We can't waste a good man." "I'll go myself." "What, you?" "Yes, I." "Why, you'd be the laughing stock of the state." "All right. Put me down for that office if I never reach the gubernatorial chair." "Say, Lane, what was the name of that Spanish fellow who went out to fight windmills and all that sort of thing?" "Never mind, Widner. You may be a good political hustler, but you're dead bad on your classics," said Lane laughingly. So they put him down for a speech in Little Africa because he himself desired it. Widner had not lied to him about Deacon Swift, as he found when he tried to get the old man to preside at the meeting. The deacon refused with indignation at the very idea, but others were more acquiescent, and Mount Moriah Church was hired at a rental that made the Reverend Ebenezer Clay and all his trustees rub their hands with glee and think well of the candidate. Also, they looked at their shiny coats and thought of new suits. There was much indignation expressed that Mount Moriah should have lent herself to such a cause, and there were murmurs even among the congregation, where the Reverend Ebenezer Clay was usually an unquestioned autocrat. But because Eve was the mother of all of us, and the thing was so new, there was a great crowd on the night of the meeting. The Reverend Ebenezer Clay presided. Lane had said, "If I can't get the bellwether to jump the way I want, I'll transfer the bell." This he had tried to do. The effort was very like him. The Reverend Mr. Clay, looking down into more frowning faces than he cared to see, spoke more boldly than he felt. He told his people that though they had their own opinions and ideas, it was well to hear both sides. He said, the brother, meaning the candidate, had a few thoughts to pussant, and he hoped they'd listen to him quietly. Then he added subtly, "Of course, Brother Lane knows we colored folks are going to think our own way anyhow." The people laughed and applauded, and Lane went to his work. They were quiet and attentive. Every now and then, some old brother grunted and shook his head, but in the main, they merely listened. Lane was pleasing, plausible, and convincing, and the brass band which he had brought with him was especially effective. The audience left the church shaking their heads with a different meaning, and all the way home there were remarks such as, "He surely told the truth. Dat man was right. They ain't no way to deny a word he said." Just at that particular moment, it looked very dark for the other candidate, especially as the brass band lingered around an hour or so and discoursed sweet music in the streets where the Negroes most did congregate. 20 years ago, such a thing could not have happened, but the ties which had bound the older generation irrevocably to one party were being loosed upon the younger men. The old men said, "We know," the young ones said, "We have heard," and so there was hardly anything of the blind allegiance which had made even free thought seem treason to their fathers. Now all of this was the reason of the great indignation that was rife in the breasts of other little Africans, and which culminated in a mass meeting called by Deacon Isham Swift and held at Bethel Chapel a few nights later. For 2 or 3 days before this congregation of the opposing elements, there were ominous mutterings. On the streets, little knots of Negroes stood and told of the terrible thing that had taken place at Mount Moriah. Shoulders were grasped, heads were wagged, and awful things prophesied as the result of this compromise with the general enemy. No one was louder in his denunciation of the treacherous course of the Reverend Ebenezer Clay than the Republican bellwether, Deacon Swift. He saw in it signs of the breakup of racial integrity, and he bemoaned the tendency loud and long. His son Tom did not tell him that he had gone to the meeting himself and had been one of those to come out, shaking his head in acquiescent doubt at the truths he had heard. But he went, as in duty bound, to his father's meeting. The church was one thronging mass of colored citizens. On the platform, from which the pulpit had been removed, sat Deacon Swift and his followers. On each side of him were banners bearing glowing inscriptions. One of the banners which the schoolmistress had prepared read, "His temples are our forts and towers, which frown upon a tyrant foe." The schoolmistress taught in a mixed school. They had mixed it by giving her a room in a white school where she had only colored pupils. Therefore, she was loyal to her party and was known as a woman of public spirit. The meeting was an enthusiastic one, but no such demonstration was shown through it all as when old Deacon Swift himself arose to address the assembly. He put Moses Jackson in the chair, and then as he walked forward to the front of the platform, a great white-haired, rugged black figure, he was heroic in his very crudeness. He wore a long, old Prince Albert coat, which swept carelessly about his thin legs. His turned-down collar was disputing territory with his tie and his waistcoat. His head was down, and he glanced out of the lower part of his eyes over the congregation, while his hands fumbled at the sides of his trousers in an embarrassment which may have been pretended or otherwise. "Mr. Chairman," he said, "for myself, I ain't no speaker. I ain't never been riz up that way. I has plowed and I has sowed, and later on I has laid sharpets and I has whitewashed. But ladies and gentlemen, I as a man, and as a man, I want to speak to you tonight. We is like a flock of sheep, and in the last week, the wolf has come among our midst. On either side, we has heard the shepherd dogs a-backing a warning unto us, but, my friends, the cotton of prosperity has been stuck in our ears for 30 years or more, if I do not disremember. We has walked the streets and the byways of this country and called ourselves femen. Away back yonder, in the days of old, like the children of Israel in Egypt, a deliverer came unto us, and Abraham Lincoln lifted the yoke from our shoulders." The audience waked up and began swaying, and there was moaning heard from both amen corners. "But my friends, I want to ask you, who was behind Abraham Lincoln? Who was it held up that man's hands when they sent bayonets and buttons to enforce his word? I want to know who was behind him. Wasn't it the publican Patty?" There were cries of, "Yes, yes, that's so." One old sister rose and waved her sunbonnet. And now I want to know in this here day a coming up if we a gwine to assert the old flag which waved over Lincoln, waved over General Butler, and led us up straight to freedom? Ladies and gentlemen and my friends, I know dar have been sudden meetings held lately in this part of dear town. I know dar have been sudden candidates which have come down here and brung us the mixed wine of Babylon. I know dar have been them of our own people who have drunk and become drunk. But I want to know, and I want to ask you tonight as my friends and my brothers, is we all a gwinner do it, huh? Is we all a gwinner drink of that wine? Is we all a gwinner reel down the political street, a staggering to and fro? Cries of, no, 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 shook the whole church. Gentlemen and ladies, said the old man, lowering his voice, the parable has been peated, and some of us, I ain't mentioning no names, and I ain't a blaming no chooch, but I say there is some of us that has sold their birthrights for a pot of cabbage. What more Deacon Swift said is hardly worth the telling, for the whole church was in confusion, and little more was heard. But he carried everything with him, and Lane's work seemed all undone. On a back seat of the church, Tom Swift, the son of the presiding officer, sat and smiled at his father unmoved because he had gone as far as the 6th grade in school and thought he knew more. As the reporters say, the meeting came to a close amid great enthusiasm. The day of election came, and Little Africa gathered as usual about the polls in the precinct. The Republicans followed their plan of not bothering about the district. They had heard of the deacons' meeting and chuckled to themselves in their committee room. Little Africa was all solid, as usual. But Lane was not done yet. His emissaries were about as thick as insurance agents, and they, as well as the Republican workers, had money to spare and to spend. Some votes, which counted only for numbers, were 50 cents apiece. But when Tom Swift came, down they knew who he was and what his influence could do. They gave him $5, and Lane had one more vote and a deal of prestige. The young man thought he was voting for his convictions. He had just cast his ballot, and the crowd was murmuring around him still at the wonder of it. For the Australian ballot has tongues as well as ears. When his father came up, with 2 or 3 of his old friends, each with the old ticket in his hands, he heard the rumor and laughed. Then he came up to Tom. "Huh?" he said. "They been saying round here you voted the Democratic ticket. Go make 'em out a lie." "I did vote the Democratic ticket," said Tom steadily. The old man fell back a step and gasped, as if he had been struck. "You did?" he cried. "You did?" "Yes," said Tom, visibly shaken. "Every man has a right." "Eve a man has a right to what?" cried the old man. "To vote as he thinks he ought to," was his son's reply. Deacon Swift's eyes were bulging and reddening. You tell me that?" His slender form towered above his son's, and his knotted, toil-hardened hands opened and closed. "You tell me that? You with your bringing up vote the way you think you're right? You lie. Tell me what they paid you, or before the Lord, I'll tie you to pieces right here." Tom wavered. He was weaker than his father. He had not gone through the same things and was not made of the same stuff. They give me $5, he said, "but it won't for voting." $5. My son sell hisself for $5. And 40 years ago, I brung 15. 100, and that was only my body, but you sell body and soul for $5. Horror and scorn and grief and anger were in the old man's tone. Tears trickled down his wrinkled face, but there was no weakness in the grip with which he took hold of his son's arms. "Take it back to him," he said. "Take it back to him. But Pap, take it back to him, I say, or your blood be on your own head." And then, Shamefaced before the crowd, driven by his father's anger, he went back to the man who had paid him and yielded up the precious banknote. Then they turned, the one head hung, the other proud in his very indignation, and made their way homeward. There was prayer meeting the next Wednesday night at Bethel Chapel. It was nearly over, and the minister was about to announce the doxology when old Deacon Swift arose. "Just a minute, brothers," he said. "I want to make a confession. I was too hard and too brash in my talk the other night, and the Lord visited my sins upon my head. He struck me in the bosom of my own family. My own son went wrong. Pray for me."